Hello, everyone. My name is Hadley German. I'm the Eugene B. Adkins Curator at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art, and I'm thrilled to be sharing with you today about Maynard Dixon and the Big Picture, Pacific Coast Billboard Advertising, 1916 to 1921. Three key points or main points of our discussion today are, first of all, regardless of the product advertised, the actual message of California billboards just following World War I is that billboards are a positive addition to the landscape. Number two, regardless of the product advertised, the underlying purpose or message of California billboards just after World War I was to sell California. And number three, design often serves different purposes for different individuals involved in its creation. So for Maynard Dixon, billboard design profoundly influenced his later work as a fine artist. Three names that you'll want to take down: Maynard Dixon, the artist that we'll be primarily talking about today. Charles W. Duncan was the sales manager at Foster and Kleiser. He's also Maynard Dixon's brother-in-law. And Foster and Kleiser is the San Francisco-based billboard advertising firm that was responsible for the work that we'll be looking at today. No medium of advertising has the right to take up the attention of the public unless it pays for that attention in terms of service or beauty. So said Charles Duncan, Foster and Kleiser's sales manager in 1921. Can you imagine this as a goal of billboard advertisers today? Why might Duncan have said this? Was he idealistic? Altruistic? Is advertising ever unselfishly motivated? Well, in part to prevent legislation banning billboards, and in part because he himself was an artist, Charles Duncan argued in 1921 that Western advertisers owed their communities beauty. He had been hired in 1915 to lead Foster and Kleiser's advertising department. Community groups were constantly fighting billboard construction during the 1910s, arguing that billboards were eyesores and at times outright immoral, depending on their subject. So how did billboard companies combat these perceptions? Foster and Kleiser and other firms hired artists to create billboards that could be considered beautiful or even as mural art. The company's goal, of course, was to prevent laws that would have restricted billboard construction. So not exactly altruistic. Foster and Kleiser also embarked on an ambitious self-promotion campaign throughout the 1910s to improve public perceptions of outdoor advertising. They sponsored community events, donated billboards for special causes, they donated camouflage work by their artists during World War I, and they regularly patted themselves on the back for these activities in local newspapers. When the firm moved its headquarters to San Francisco in 1915, its sales manager, Charles Duncan, almost immediately began hiring well-known local artists. One of his first hires was the famous Western illustrator, his brother-in-law, Maynard Dixon. Maynard Dixon agreed with Charles Duncan. He argued that quote-unquote ugly advertising of previous decades had forced businesses to quote turn to beautiful design in order to get themselves back into the good graces of the critical public, end quote. So what did he mean by ugly advertising? Really, he meant cluttered, elaborate designs popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. Designs like this, that feature lots of overlapping elements and decorative lettering. Notice all of those overlapping scenes, each in its own frame. There are ribbons, there's lettering that's on a curved baseline, there's lettering on a straight baseline, there's different kinds of lettering. It's time-consuming to digest each part of the image. By contrast, modernism in graphic design was, like in fine art, a continual move towards more simplified forms with less text. So what characterized beautiful design as Dixon described it? Or a better question might be, what defined beauty for Maynard Dixon and Charles Duncan on West Coast billboards? Charles Duncan lectured about beauty in popular talks and in an article series that ran in the trade journal Western Advertising in 1921. He asserted beauty emanated from color in both the literal and metaphorical sense. In fact, Duncan's chief crusade involved broadly promoting color as a cure for a troubled world reeling from World War I, and as a cure for the malaise induced by corporate offices, whose bleakness, he claimed, quote, drives many a man to drink, end quote. Dixon summarized Duncan's philosophy toward color, literal pigments that is, in this way, quote, color attracts us, and its right use depends on an understanding of its psychological effect, which is as certain and calculable as the effect of rain and sunlight. All about us, largely unused or misused, there are living color and character, which make beauty, here awaiting the promoter wise enough to trust the artist who is trained to see and use them, end quote. So what is Dixon saying? What is his recipe for beauty? It's important to note that Dixon identified beauty as a byproduct of not just color, but color and character together. Furthermore, he believed that beauty stemmed from, quote, color and character here, end quote. What does he mean by here? Well, he means the colors and character of Northern California. Character in this context referred not so much to human traits, but to the particular nature of the region itself. Also, Dixon implies that only artists possess the ability to understand and successfully translate color and character into psychologically manipulative images needed by the business world. Color was, in this sense, used by artists to manipulate viewers' emotions in order to sell products. But it was also simultaneously employed by Dixon and Duncan to sell the business world on the particular skills of trained artists. Let's look at some of Dixon's and his colleagues' billboard designs and see if we can identify any characteristics of the use of color or composition in these images to see how Duncan's ideals were expressed in practice. Take a look at this billboard design by Harold von Schmidt. So it's a billboard promoting a jewelry store, and it's doing so with this image of two pirates inspecting their loot. Take a look at the colors. What colors are used? What colors are absent? Well, throughout, you're going to see these billboard studies are going to avoid hues that Duncan claimed had a, quote, depressing color influence, end quote. That is, colors he associated with office buildings and hospitals, dreary gray, pale washed out blue, and sickly white. These are billboard designs by Maurice Delmieux. They're gouache studies. They're studies for billboards for Hills Brothers Coffee. So that large red can in the foreground is actually a coffee tin. It was a coffee company that was based out of California, so it's interesting that they're choosing an exotic North African setting for the landscape in which to set this ginormous coffee can. Moonlight subtly illuminates the village's palm trees, mosques, and minarets in the distance. The pleasing blues recede visually, contrasting with and emphasizing the brilliant, warm red object in the foreground. So by now you've seen a couple of these billboard designs. You might be recognizing some similarities of color or composition. Typically, they're going to feature complementary colors and strong value contrasts. Complementary colors are colors that are opposite of each other on the color wheel. So red and green, purple and yellow, blue and orange. These are colors that kind of create a visual tension. They vibrate against each other. So the red of that can really kind of pops against that blue-green sky and the kind of blue-green hill in the deep distance. Oftentimes, they're going to make use of crimson lettering or flashes of red that really dazzle the eye against complementary pale green, light turquoise, or deep blue. And I want you to take note of the compositional structure of these as well. Are they symmetrical? Are they asymmetrical? Are there any similarities of form? Oftentimes, you're going to find a triangular shape, so look for that. If you look back at the pirate billboard study a few slides ago, the form of those pirates, if you drew kind of an outline around them, is a triangle, and it's pushed right up at the front of the picture plane. The triangle in this study is, of course, that mountain in the background, which stretches from one end of the picture space to the other. And then oftentimes there's going to be some object that's placed really close to the picture plane in the foreground. And usually that's the object that Foster and Kleiser is selling. So in this case, the coffee can is right in front, and it is a gargantuan scale. Of course, this is probably because they want people to be able to see it if they're driving by in an automobile. Even if you kind of blur out the background as you're driving by, you're not going to miss that giant red can, right? And then something else to look for are objects that cross from the very bottom of picture space all the way to the top. So in that case, or in this case, it's the palm tree at the right. And these objects that cross from the bottom to the top or the top to the bottom, they tend to divide picture space. They create interesting negative spaces on either side, and they kind of create a screen that separates us in the foreground from deep distance. So, the ingredients for beautiful advertising, according to Duncan and Dixon, included color-rich paintings created by art school trained artists. But what did Dixon mean by the color and character of the region? If you recall, he said that beauty in advertising emerged from color and character here. By here, he means the American West, but more specifically, California. Typically, Dixon's and his colleagues' billboards featured pastoral subjects or cheerful images of the white upper class enjoying outdoor activities. This idyllic view of California life is evident in Dixon's 1917 billboard designs for Coca-Cola. Let's read these scenes. And by the way, these are photographs that would have been used to reproduce the billboards in magazines like Western Advertising. They're in black and white because color photography had not been invented yet. So, what's going on in this first image? Where is the setting? Why are those horses wearing English tack? And there's a detail on the next slide so you can look more closely. Is this image focused on the product, Coca-Cola, or is it focused on a certain lifestyle? Why might that be? What are the individuals in this study drinking? Look at the glasses, especially in the detail on the following page. What kind of glasses are they? Are these characters drinking Coke? What's going on here? The tagline "Relieves Fatigue" features prominently under the Coca-Cola logo in this design of young people observing, with varying degrees of attentiveness, a tennis match. The scene implies that Coke not only relieves fatigue and enhances energy, evidently that young woman at the far right who's leaping backwards has imbibed already, but it also imbues consumers with charm, cheer, and good humor. This notion is illustrated in a third image that lacks the backdrop of a field or a court. So what's going on here? Where is this taking place? Inside or outside? Are these figures at this restaurant drinking Coca-Cola? Does Coca-Cola make you this chatty and coiffed? What is the image implying? The action takes place inside, presumably, a restaurant with expansive windows. The sport at hand is not polo or tennis, but social conversation. The young man with ruddy cheeks raises an empty glass, meeting the gaze of the waitress behind him. She leans toward him, her cheeks flushed. Meanwhile, his date, that woman with the giant hat with her back to us, speaks to a smartly dressed, bespectacled young man to her left. The animated exchange between those two figures may explain the blushing man's anxious glance at the waitress, his supplication for additional liquid fortification. So, what do these images mean? What do they communicate about Coke? You have to remember that in 1917, the country is on the brink of prohibition. Dixon pictures Coke as an alternative to alcohol, classy enough for polo matches or horse sales. energy inducing enough for sports, and liquid courage for awkward dates. In some, Coca-Cola itself receives little actual real estate on Dixon's designs. Instead, the artist sells the soft drink through images of a superficially sophisticated and active lifestyle. The character of these images is one of cheerful optimism, wit, and vivacity, expressed through depictions of young white Californians at leisure outdoors. Let me repeat. They depict individuals at leisure enjoying the outdoors. In fact, many Foster and Kleiser billboards from the late 1910s depict the outdoors, specifically identifiable Western landscapes or California settings. Nature is present even in the billboard at bottom, whose action takes place inside a restaurant. Picture windows span the background, and piles of flowers spill from the two large urns in the foreground. The natural world, in other words, physically frames even this interior scene. It would be difficult to determine what percentage of Foster and Kleiser's billboards actually depicted natural settings compared to indoor activities or products, simply because the billboards and original artwork for them no longer exists. What you're seeing today is very rare. However, in booklets promoting their wares and in illustrations of their work published in Western Advertising, a magazine, images of outdoor, particularly California, scenery predominates. Here's an example from Foster and Kleiser's 1925 booklet published to attract Los Angeles businesses. In this illustration, two billboards of California scenery hinge together to form a diptych. In the billboard at left, Yosemite National Park's iconic monolith, Half Dome, looms behind a pastoral image of grazing dairy cows. Large lettering identifies the product, Borden's milk, in a horizontal band beneath the landscape. And a mammoth-sized can of milk dominates the right foreground, as tall as the distant rock face. It's a little like the Hills Brothers coffee compositions, isn't it? The words "made up Modesto" float in the pale green sky at upper left. Perhaps the oddest thing about this tranquil image is not what is included, the enormous can of milk, for instance, but what is absent. Half Dome is visible from Modesto on a clear day, but it is 100 miles away and dwarfed by the adjacent peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Take a look at the next slide. That's right. Foster and Kleiser's artists eliminated the mountains, divorcing the iconic landmass from its actual surroundings and enlarging it to heroic scale, much like the milk can. In doing so, they presented a distinctive profile that viewers in Los Angeles or visitors from out of state might recognize. So here, in the circle that I've added on top, is Half Dome, and you can see the mountains surrounding it, which are not in the Borden's milk billboard. And as I noted at the bottom, this photograph was considered controversial. There was some discussion as to whether or not the photographer had manipulated the image to even be able to see Half Dome that clearly from this distance. Golden light illuminates Half Dome's western crags, while the rest of the monolith is cast in deep shadow against a mint green sky. I posit that the quiet and serene landscape at twilight promotes California's Central Valley as powerfully as the billboard endorses the more prosaic, but less romantic, tinned milk. The same pale green sky floods the background of the billboard for Sonora phonographs at right. The billboard exemplifies romantic fantasy. A man and woman at right relax on a porch, presumably enjoying the view and twilight setting. There, reality ends. An oversized phonograph, presumably enlarged like the Borden's milk can for visibility at high speeds, occupies the deck just to their left. Two female figures clad in gauze chasse away from the phonograph into open air. They float above low hills. Their feet do not touch the ground. So these figures suggest personifications of sound waves, perhaps ballet music, wafting across the air. Viewed together, these billboards suggest expansive space. The low horizon of the Borden's billboard and distant hills of the Sonora billboard visually unite into one continuous horizon line. Surrounded by an architectural white frame and lattices, they together resemble a picture window opening from the grunge of the city into a bucolic green space populated by serene figures, music, and cattle. Lit from above and surrounded by ornate frames featuring voluptuous women, they resemble paintings. And you'll notice even in the foreground, there's a small figure who's bent over planting flowers in front of these billboards. So Foster and Kleiser would frame their billboards. They would put these kind of caryatid-like figures, these female figures who were supposed to personify California's bounty, on either side, and then they would light them, really as if they're lighting paintings. Such images resemble Duncan's ideals in practice. He boasted, quote, "We are bringing art to the streets through the modern billboard," end quote. On one hand, these billboards reflect Foster and Kleiser's appeal to critics of outdoor advertising by presenting images akin to landscape paintings, combined with references to other forms of high art, ballet, and classical music. However, in portraying themselves as producers of such scenery and self-promotional materials, Foster and Kleiser also aligned with California Booster's larger objective to promote the region, not just its products, to a national audience. The view of Half Dome situates Borden's, a national company, inside California for local audiences. For out-of-state viewers, it pictures Borden's in an Edenic West Coast setting. So here's a question. What do you get if you remove the milk and the phonograph? Remove the tin of milk and oversized phonograph from these images, and what remains is a grand, idyllic advertisement for California. In 1920, Dixon began designing billboards and newspaper advertisements for Foster and Kleiser's new client, the Spreckels Savage Tire Company of San Diego. The company, named for its founder, Arthur W. Savage, manufactured puncture-proof steel tires that could withstand rough western roads. Prior to Foster and Kleiser's acquisition of the account, Savage's print ads typically traded on racial stereotypes, featuring crude cuts of a generic Plains Indian figure wearing a feather bonnet, wielding a weapon, and often accompanied by the cringe-worthy slogan, "Savages invade." And there's an example on the next slide of the kind of typical imagery that Savage Tires used in its advertising materials before Foster and Kleiser and Dixon were involved. Dixon proposed an alternative to the violent and derogatory images of Plains people depicted on Savage's advertising prior to 1920. While he had no control over his client's name, his images challenged the meaning of the term savage as presented in the earlier advertising campaign. He did this by romanticizing indigenous, specifically Blackfeet, life as a colorful pageant of outdoor freedom. In essence, he exchanged one set of falsehoods for another, trading the melodramatic, violent portrayal of Native Americans in popular illustration in the early 20th century for a color-rich, nostalgic, and paternalistic portrayal of Blackfeet life in line with Duncan's ideals of beautiful advertising. So how did he do that? Rather than apply the term savage to people, Dixon's billboards characterize the tire itself as a wild creature, and they make the protagonist of these images, most often, a young Blackfeet boy. Now, as I said, rather than apply the term savage to people, Dixon's billboards characterized the tire itself as a wild creature and made the protagonist of these images a young Blackfeet boy. So here are two gouache studies for billboards that Dixon designed for Savage Tires. And you can read this entire series as a narrative. And I haven't included all of them in these slides, but just enough that you can get the gist. So in the upper image, the young boy is straining against the taut end of a lariat. Rendered out of proportion in heroic scale, the mammoth tire at far right escapes the bounds of picture space, looming above the low, distant mesas and its youthful captor. And because this landscape is not a Montana landscape where the Blackfeet actually reside, this looks more like southern Utah, maybe Arizona. There's the suggestion that he's traveled down here to capture this tire, which is, something like a Mustang out in the desert, and he's going to take it back with him to Blackfeet country. Now, in the lower image, a zoomorphic tire again threatens the child in a study where he aims an arrow at, presumably, a competitor's inferior tube. So this is not a savage inner tube, this tube that's crumpled up on the right. This is probably supposed to represent a tube by another company, okay? Now the tube is rearing up rattlesnake-like. It's bearing its stem valve as if, it looks like fangs, as if it's ready to strike this small child who's smaller than the tube, right? So Dixon and Foster and Kleiser intend the viewer to empathize with the child. In contrast to the narrative scenes of the young boy pitted against the tire, other extant studies intended for Foster and Kleiser's deluxe urban billboards pictured Blackfeet life much like the California lifestyle on its other billboards. That is, idyllic, romanticized, colorful, and out of doors. This is evident in this gouache study that dramatically demonstrates Duncan's color preferences. Red lettering glows against deep blue, echoing the central figure's red blanket and the firelight that illuminates the edges of the figures in the foreground. Here, it seems, stories are being told about the mammoth tire at camp. How were these installed? Here you can see one of Dixon's billboards in Los Angeles. They were incredibly popular. The Savage Tires campaign received a lot of attention in period newspaper articles and advertising journals. Dixon's more narrative designs and those with Blackfeet subjects were installed in urban areas. The tire company celebrated them as associating their tires with works of art. By contrast, Savage billboards along rural highways, where speeds were faster and viewers had less time to absorb the image, focused on the tires, not the Blackfeet narrative. You can see how much even these painterly minimal images stood out against the clutter of more text-heavy designs surrounding them. Also notice the columns and lighting. So while there are no female figures attached to these columns, there's still kind of an architectural feel to the structure that the paintings or the billboards are mounted to. In another color-rich image, the tire's rugged tread is directly compared to the all-terrain soles and geometric patterns on brightly beaded moccasins. And I believe this would have been the kind of image that Foster and Kleiser would have erected on a rural highway, where the emphasis is more on the tire itself. Okay, you could drive by and not realize that there are figures who are cropped off by the top half or the top edge of picture space, but you wouldn't miss that tire, right? Here, the tire emblemizes not the Blackfeet so much as their lifestyle, a lifestyle essentialized as being freely on the move outdoors. In reality, the Blackfeet no longer enjoyed such freedom of movement. The reservation system, allotment, and successive reductions of their homeland by the U.S. government during the 19th century had established political, social, and economic boundaries that, by 1920, constrained their movements in multiple ways. Such boundaries are not evident in Dixon's billboards. For affluent consumers able to afford Savage's higher-priced tires, the images were intended to drum up wanderlust and convince consumers that by outfitting their car with Savage tires, they too could roam Western landscapes. Like Dixon's Coca-Cola billboards, they appeal to viewers' desire for a particular but romanticized Western lifestyle, rather than by romanticizing the product itself. And here you have an example of the tire making its way to California. So that's Half Dome, which we've seen before, in the background of this particular design So the tire was used exclusively in Yosemite for 2 years, the billboard proclaims. Now, Dixon's romantic portrayal of Blackfeet on billboards and in advertising illustrations in 1921 and 1922 may also reflect his nostalgia for a brief escape to Montana with his daughter Constance, following his contentious divorce in 1917. Foster and Kleiser and the Great Northern Railway arranged the trip, assigning Dixon to create advertising posters and paintings for Glacier National Park hotels. Dixon jumped at the chance to not only paint and travel in Montana, but to remove Constance from his ex-wife's control. Father and daughter camped just outside Glacier National Park with 6 Blackfeet families who sang, told stories, and modeled for him. They welcomed the Dixons to the dances and sweat lodge. Of these new acquaintances, Dixon wrote, quote, "The Blackfeet are the best Indians I have seen yet, bar none," end quote. Constance would later recall sobbing when they left in October, quote, "I wanted to stay and become an Indian," end quote. Dixon's billboards, in a sense, express a similar attitude, a longing by outsiders to escape their problems and vicariously, quote, "become an Indian," end quote. For Savage's Tire's leaders, such images constituted what they considered to be, quote, "faithful portrayals of Indians and Indian life," end quote. That was actually in a newspaper article written by one of Savage's presidents. But ultimately, in these presentations, Dixon and his employers merely traded one set of untruths, savagery, for another, romance. The billboard designs did, however, offer Dixon an opportunity to experiment with compositional structures that would reach fruition in his mature paintings of the 1930s. These billboard designs did, however, offer Dixon an opportunity to experiment with compositional structures that would reach fruition in his mature paintings of the 1930s. He celebrated design that exhibited a, quote, "balanced composition and arrangement of the color masses," end quote. Typically, Dixon built balanced, asymmetrical billboard compositions on a 4-column grid, with large foreground color masses, whether tire, cowboy, or waiter, occupying 1 or 2 column widths on the front edge of picture space. So what does that mean? Well, if you look at this design and imagine it divided into quadrants vertically. So the cowboy occupies the 3rd quadrant if we're counting from left to right. The Spur Cigarettes text, that occupies the left 2 quadrants, and then that section of the wall that has "he knows" inscribed on it, that occupies the 4th quadrant. Okay, so it's a 4-column grid. There are 4 columns breaking up space. And then the large foreground color mass, that would be this kind of teal color of the cowboy's shirt. And notice again, it's kind of a triangular form. If you go vertically up from his waist to the top of his hat and then follow, your eye kind of follows down to his hand, to the reins. There's this it's a triangular form right on the front of picture space, okay? But he's not centered, it's an asymmetrical composition. Now, he habitually broke the horizon line and shallow diagonals ubiquitous in his billboards with heroic scaled foreground figures. Okay, so this is something Dixon does in his later paintings, and you can really see it here in this billboard. So there's no horizon line in this billboard because there's no horizon, but that kind of shallow diagonal of the top of the wall that's angling down across picture space, that you find again and again in Dixon's later paintings and also in his billboards. So it kind of functions as a horizon line, and the cowboy and then the spectator who's leaning over it, they're breaking that horizon line. These large objects, okay, so the cowboy in this case, extend beyond the picture frame into the viewer's space, dividing the composition into dynamic negative shapes. Okay, so you've got this kind of rectangular negative space behind the cowboy, and then you have this kind of triangular space that's formed between his hand, the man's hand above him, and then the reins, and then this other kind of rectangular space to the left of that. Low horizons, shallow diagonals, and large foreground objects that interrupt the canvas's horizontality appear repeatedly in Dixon's subsequent paintings. Okay, so take a look at the next page. So low horizons, shallow diagonals, and large foreground objects that interrupt the canvas's horizontality appear repeatedly in Dixon's subsequent paintings. In fact, Dixon's easel painting, Saddle Horses Grazing, shown here, completed shortly after the artist's departure from Foster and Kleiser in 1921, could easily be mistaken for a billboard promoting California. The row of eucalyptus trees form a decorative foreground screen right at the surface of picture space that, like the Savage Tire or the Cowboy, divides surrounding space. The composition of Dixon's Forgotten Man, 1934, even more clearly mimics, that is mirrors, Dixon's billboard design for Blackfoot Tread. Forgotten Man's high vantage point, low diagonal of the curb, the large foreground form, that's the man, and the rhythmic pattern of feet at the top of picture space echo both the billboard's structure and content. So take a look at the next slide. Wow! So Dixon basically took his billboard and reversed it, and that's the composition for this painting, made 14 years later. The negative space reserved for text in the billboard, okay, so the lower right, in this case where I've reversed it, the lower right, becomes an empty expanse of curb, sidewalk, and street in the later painting that emphasizes the man's isolation from the crowd bustling past. While Dixon's Forgotten Man paintings of the 1930s differ in subject from his billboards, they reprise the division of space and compositional structures of the early advertisements. So just as an example, across the bottom you have 3 paintings from Dixon's Forgotten Man series of the 1930s. And I just wanted to share these with you so you could see the compositional similarity to his billboard designs. In almost all of them, you have a shallow diagonal at one point. You have low horizon lines. You have larger figures that break horizontal or shallow diagonals. Okay, the use of lighting. I think that figure with his thumb extended, he's kind of silhouetted against the bright white background in the far left. There's a similarity between that kind of compositional structure and then this Savage Chords structure at the top, where you have the figure kind of breaking up negative space in an interesting way. But the low horizons and shallow diagonals of land in Dixon's billboards also suggest expansive western spaces, grand vistas extending beyond the billboard's edges. Meanwhile, the foreground objects, products, whether tires, milk cans, or marching hunters, prevent the viewer's gaze from accessing deep distance. Such restricted vision encourages us to look harder, to peer further. In urban settings, the restricted vision encourages a sense of longing in the passers-by, not for tires or cigarettes. These images, with their glimpses of California or Montana in the distance, promote longing for idyllic outdoor experience in a sun-drenched paradise that cannot be achieved by purchasing tires, cigarettes, or coffee. Here you have Maynard Dixon's Home of the Blackfeet, painted in 1936, really one of the only easel paintings of his career that refers back to that period he spent in Montana in 1917 working for Foster and Kleiser. And I think it's amazing that, in 1922, so 14 years earlier, he had created this Savage Tires billboard, and it no longer exists. There's no gouache study. All we have is this tiny, terrible image that was published in Western Advertising, and the image looks terrible because it was about an inch across at the most, in black and white in that trade journal. And look, if you crop that section of Home of the Blackfeet around the teepee and the cabin and the horse, you get almost a very similar kind of perspective. If you were actually down at ground level, you would kind of get a similar vantage point as you get in the billboard design. So, on the heels of the international trauma of World War I and in the midst of Prohibition, I assert that these billboards, Dixon's billboards, Foster and Kleiser's billboards, together advertise the West itself more than any individual product. They sell the West, and particularly California, as a land of opportunity, optimism, and adventure. For Maynard Dixon, they formed a laboratory in which to develop compositions that informed the rest of his career as an easel painter. For Foster and Kleiser, they successfully sold the notion that billboards could be beautiful, so successfully that we remain inundated with not so beautiful billboards today, a century later. And finally, they contributed to the development of a West Coast advertising style characterized by harmonious color combinations, limited text, and idyllic views of outdoor life. If you came to class with certain assumptions about California's colors, landscapes, and lifestyle, you owe those assumptions, those perceptions, in part to Maynard Dixon and his colleagues at Foster and Kleiser a century ago. Thank you all. If you have any questions or are interested in the Maynard Dixons in our collection, please feel free to reach out to me. I look forward to seeing you all in the museum, hopefully soon. Take care, stay safe, and be well.